When people ask me why Russia seems incapable of maintaining peaceful relationships with its neighbors, they're often looking for some recent explanation, some Cold War dynamic or post Soviet grievance that might account for the persistent hostility. But when I examine this through the lens of military history, what becomes clear is that we're dealing with something much deeper and more systematic than contemporary politics. We're looking at a 700-year pattern of imperial behavior that has remained remarkably consistent across different rulers, different ideologies, and different historical epochs. The fundamental problem is that Russia doesn't just have neighbors in the way normal countries do. Russia has what I call an imperial appetite that treats neighboring territories not as sovereign entities deserving respect, but as natural extensions of Russian power waiting to be absorbed. This isn't some modern aberration. This is how the Russian state has operated since it first emerged as a recognizable political entity in medieval times. Let me take you back to understand how this pattern began. Russia started as the Principality of Muscovy, just one among many competing Russian principalities in the medieval period. But even then, the template was being established. Muscovy didn't seek to coexist with its neighbors. It systematically eliminated them. Novgorod the Great, which had developed a remarkable merchant republic with democratic assemblies, was completely destroyed, not defeated, not subjugated, but erased as a political entity. The same fate befell Pskov, Ryazan, Tver, and dozens of other principalities that you've never heard of precisely because Moscow wiped them from the map. This wasn't normal medieval conquest where you might vassalize a neighbor or extract tribute. This was systematic absorption designed to eliminate alternative ways of organizing political life. Moscow couldn't tolerate the existence of Novgorod's merchant democracy because it represented a different model of how Russian speaking peoples might govern themselves. So they destroyed it completely, deported its population, and made sure that model could never reemerge. The pattern established in medieval times has persisted with remarkable consistency. As Russia expanded, it encountered the sophisticated Khanates of Central Asia, Crimea, Kazan, Astrakhan, Kokand, Khiva, Bukhara. These weren't primitive societies. They were complex political entities with their own administrative systems, trade networks, cultural traditions, and diplomatic relationships. Russia didn't seek to establish normal state to state relationships with them. It systematically eliminated every single one, not just conquering their territories, but erasing them as political concepts. What makes this pattern particularly revealing is how it contrasts with the behavior of other expanding powers. When the British Empire expanded, it often maintained existing political structures under indirect rule. When the Ottoman Empire expanded, it frequently allowed local rulers to maintain authority as long as they acknowledged Ottoman suzerainty. Russia's approach was different. Russia eliminates, Russia absorbs, Russia erases alternatives. Look at what happened to Poland, a major European power that should have been too large and too sophisticated for this treatment. Three partitions in the 18th century, orchestrated with Prussia and Austria, carved Poland completely off the map. But even that wasn't enough for Russia. After World War II, they insisted at Yalta on moving Poland 200 kilometers to the west, deep into German territory, so they could absorb a significant chunk of historic Polish lands. Then they ethnically cleansed the entire region, moving millions of people in the devastated aftermath of war, ensuring that for the first time in their histories, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Ukraine became ethnically homogeneous states. This wasn't accidental. This was policy designed to eliminate the kind of ethnic and cultural diversity that might provide a basis for future resistance to Russian control. If you can't have multiple ethnic groups within the same territory providing alternative sources of identity and loyalty, then resistance becomes much harder to organize and sustain. But here's what I find most telling about Russia's relationship with its neighbors. They genuinely don't understand why everyone fears them. Russians have convinced themselves that they're the victims in these relationships, that their neighbors are unreasonably hostile. that NATO expansion is some sort of Western conspiracy designed to threaten peaceful Russia. This level of self delusion would be almost comical if it weren't so dangerous. Russia has posed an existential threat to its neighbors for 7 centuries. There are so many neighbors you've never heard of precisely because they disappeared from the pages of history, courtesy of Russian expansion. When I tell students about the Khanate of Khiva or the Merchant Republic of Novgorod, they look at me blankly because these places no longer exist. That's not normal. Most historical political entities leave some trace, some successor state, or cultural legacy. Russia's neighbors often don't because Russia doesn't just defeat them, it erases them. The Soviet period, which many people think of as ideologically different from Tsarist Russia, actually perfected and systematized these techniques. The Soviets developed what I call a template for block building that they applied across Eastern Europe after World War II. They would control the power ministries, defense, and interior, giving them a monopoly on coercion. They would control justice and information, allowing them to arrest or kill opposition at will while controlling all the narratives about what was happening. They would control agriculture, buying loyalty through land redistribution while eliminating class enemies and potential resistance leaders. And they would wrap it all in a fiction of independence and democracy. Poland was still called Poland, but it wasn't independent. They held elections, but the outcomes were predetermined. This was imperial control disguised as liberation, and it was applied systematically across every country in Eastern Europe that the Red Army could reach. What made this even more insidious was the big lie that accompanied it. The Soviets presented themselves as anti imperialist, opposed to the Western colonial powers that were indeed giving up their empires during this period. Meanwhile, Russia was practicing the most successful imperialism of the 20th century, absorbing more territory and subjugating more peoples than any other power. The cognitive dissonance was breathtaking, but it worked because people wanted to believe that there was an anti imperialist alternative to Western capitalism. The regional template was equally systematic: ethnic cleansing to eliminate potential sources of resistance, moving entire countries like shifting Poland westward and Mongolia eastward into Chinese territory, creating stepping stones for future expansion through places like Kaliningrad and Moldova, and most cleverly, creating divided states wherever possible: Germany, Korea, Vietnam, China. If you can keep your neighbors fighting over their own borders, they can't organize effective resistance to your expansion. This helps explain why, at the end of the Cold War, there was what looked like a stampede into NATO. It wasn't NATO expansion in any meaningful sense. It was these countries running toward any security guarantee they could find based on centuries of experience with Russian imperialism. And they were absolutely right to do so, as subsequent events have proven. Putin's behavior toward Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova is just the latest iteration of this ancient pattern. He's not responding to NATO expansion or Western aggression. He's following the same imperial template that his predecessors have used for 7 centuries. The stepping stone strategy: Chechnya, then Georgia, then Ukraine. Each success builds momentum for the next. Each acquisition of territory demonstrates Russian strength and provides a platform for the next expansion. The tragedy is that this pattern is ultimately self defeating. By treating every neighbor as a potential victim rather than a potential partner, Russia ensures that it will always face coalitions of frightened neighbors seeking outside protection. By refusing to develop normal state to state relationships based on mutual benefit, Russia forces its neighbors to choose between submission and resistance. Most of them, quite reasonably, choose resistance. What's particularly frustrating is that Russia has so much to offer. It has enormous natural resources, an educated population, a rich cultural heritage, and geographical advantages that could make it a natural bridge between Europe and Asia. But instead of leveraging these advantages through normal diplomatic and economic relationships, Russia keeps choosing the imperial path that ultimately isolates it and constrains its development. The current war in Ukraine is perhaps the clearest example of how self defeating this pattern has become. Putin launched this war thinking it would demonstrate Russian strength and restore Russian imperial control over what he considers naturally Russian territory. Instead, it has revealed Russian military weaknesses, strengthened NATO, pushed Finland and Sweden into the alliance, and isolated Russia economically and diplomatically to a degree that seemed impossible just a few years ago. But the most dangerous aspect of Russia's inability to get along with its neighbors isn't what it means for Europe, it's what it means for Russia's relationship with China. While Putin has been focused on reconstructing the Russian Empire in the West, he has been steadily weakening Russia's position in the East. The war in Ukraine is consuming Russian military resources and attention while China quietly builds influence throughout Central Asia and Siberia. The historical irony is almost perfect. Russia's imperial ambitions in the West may end up delivering it into imperial subordination in the East. The very behaviors that Russia has used to dominate its European neighbors for centuries may now be used against Russia by a much more powerful and systematic imperial power. China has studied Russian imperial techniques carefully, but China also has advantages that Russia has never possessed: a massive domestic market, technological sophistication, economic dynamism, and demographic weight. If China decides to apply Russian style imperial pressure to Russian territory in Siberia and Central Asia, Russia may discover what it feels like to be on the receiving end of the imperial appetite it has inflicted on others for 7 centuries. The question isn't whether Russia can learn to get along with its neighbors. 700 years of consistent behavior suggests this is unlikely. The question is whether Russia can adapt to a world where it is no longer the dominant imperial power in its region, where its neighbors have alternatives to Russian pressure, and where its traditional tactics may be turned against it by powers with greater resources and more sophisticated strategies. Understanding this historical pattern doesn't make Russia's behavior excusable, but it does make it predictable. And if we understand the pattern, we can better prepare for its future manifestations and work to contain its most destructive effects. Because this pattern shows no signs of changing, and the costs of ignoring it continue to grow higher for everyone involved.